It did not begin with the smile. It began, as all things in Fayette County did, with the land. The land remembered everything. It held the iron from the blood and the salt from the tears, and in 1891 it gave back only what it was forced to, grudgingly, under the suffocating blanket of a Tennessee summer. The war was over. Emancipation was a word spoken in courthouse documents 26 years gone, but the air on the Thorn plantation, now the Thorn sharecropping expanse, had not changed. It was the same air, thick with the same humidity, carrying the same scent of pine and bruised cotton. Samuel Whitlock was 17. He had been born legally free, a technicality that meant he was free to owe Colonel Elias Thorn for seed, free to owe him for tools, and free to live in the same cabin his father had inhabited when he was property. Samuel's hands were not his own. They belonged to the cotton, and the cotton belonged to Thorn. Before Samuel spoke, he spoke of the ache in his back, of the thinness of the stew, of the way his little sister, Ilara, could weave dolls from dried corn husks that looked almost alive. He spoke to his father, Marcus, a man bent not by age but by memory, who saw the world only in shades of necessary labor. Then came the reckoning. It was not a storm, not a fire. It was quieter, sharper. It was the scrape of a pen in a ledger book. Colonel Thorn, a man whose face was a fleshy map of indulgence and inherited anxieties, had decided on efficiency. The old mule, Jed, the one Marcus had used for a decade, the one that represented the Whitlock's razor-thin margin of autonomy, was deemed unfit. It was, Thorn declared from the shade of his wide veranda, a drain on resources. Marcus, Thorn had said, not unkindly, which was always worse, the animal is lame. It eats feed that healthier stock requires. Sir, he pulls, Marcus pleaded, hat in hand, eyes on the polished boots. He pulls true, just slow. Slow is the same as stopped in this economy, Marcus, Thorn sighed, a performance of reluctance. I'm afraid Jed goes to the tannery. You'll share the picket's mule. It means you'll work the night plot. The night plot, a death sentence for a crop. The soil there was clay, hard and unforgiving, and working by lantern light meant inefficiency, meant mistakes, meant a smaller share. It meant ruin. Samuel watched his father nod, the vertebrae in his neck seeming to compress one by one. The change was immediate. Ilara, only 6, was now required in the fields alongside Samuel to make up the lost time. Her hands, meant for cornhusk dolls, were split by the sharp bowls. The work stretched from can't see to can't see. The margin wasn't just gone, it was inverted. They were falling into a hole they could not climb. 2 weeks into the night plot, the fever came for Ilara. It came fast, a fire in her small body. The nearest doctor was in Somerville, 12 miles away, a white doctor who required cash Samuel's family did not have. They used cold rags and prayed. Marcus begged Thorn for an advance, a loan, anything. Thorn was reviewing his ledgers. He didn't look up. Sickness is a luxury, Marcus. The crop won't wait. If I give to you, I must give to all. He dipped his pen. Be grateful you have work at all. Ilara died on a Tuesday, while Samuel was pulling cotton in the dark, his hands bleeding in the lantern light. Samuel was the one who found her. He had come in from the field, his body a single screaming ache, and found his mother rocking a still, cool bundle. Marcus was outside, standing motionless, staring at the cabin wall as if he could see through it, back to a time that made sense. Samuel looked at his sister. He looked at her small, perfect hands, now stained and scarred. He looked at the cornhusk doll clutched in her fingers. He felt something inside him shift, like ice breaking deep underwater. It was not anger. Anger was hot and fast, a fire that burned itself out. This was cold. It was the cold of the bottom of the well. He walked out of the cabin, past his father. He walked the half-mile to the big house where lights glowed warm and yellow. He stood by the fence line near the crepe myrtles. He could see Colonel Thorn through the dining room window, lifting a glass of dark liquid to his lips, laughing at something one of his guests had said, and Samuel smiled. It was not a smile of humor, nor of madness. It was a smile of absolute, terrifying clarity. It was a smile that acknowledged a fundamental truth: the ledger, the mule, the sickness, the laughter. It was all one system. He saw it, complete and perfect in its cruelty. He stood there for an hour unmoving, just smiling at the house. From that night, Samuel Whitlock stopped speaking. The silence was a presence. It filled the cabin, heavier than the humidity. His mother tried to break it, pleading with him, offering him food he would not eat. His father, already lost in his own cavern of grief, simply looked away. The other sharecroppers gave him a wide berth. A boy who does not speak after a death is a boy marked by sorrow. But a boy who smiles, that was something else. That was unnatural. His smile was constant. It was faint, a slight upward pull at the corners of his mouth, and it was never directed at a person. He smiled at the empty chair Ilara had used. He smiled at the hook where Jed's harness had hung. He smiled at the hardened clay of the night plot. Colonel Thorne noticed the change a week later. Samuel was working the line, moving with a steady, robotic pace. Thorne rode by on his chestnut mare, barking orders about the pace. "You boy, Samuel, pick it up. The weigh-in is at 5. Samuel paused. He turned his head slowly. He looked not at Thorne, but at the empty air just to the left of the colonel's head, and he smiled. Thorne reined in his horse. "Did you hear me, boy? I gave you an instruction." Samuel's smile did not waver. It was serene. It was knowing. He held the gaze on the empty space, then slowly turned back to the cotton row and resumed his work, still smiling. A flicker of irritation crossed Thorne's face. Insolence was a whip-worthy offense. But this wasn't insolence. It wasn't defiance. It was nothing. It was a void. "How did you punish a void?" Thorne grunted, attributing it to grief sickness, and rode on. But he felt a prickle on his neck. The haunting began not with a ghost, but with a presence. Samuel started to appear places. He finished his work on the night plot, and instead of collapsing into his cot, he would walk. He would stand at the edge of the woods, just beyond the manicured lawn of the big house, and smile at the windows. The first time, a house servant saw him and shrieked, thinking him a spirit. Thorne came out onto the veranda, a whiskey in one hand, a pistol in the other. "Who's there?" he boomed. Samuel stood in the moonlight, 100 yards away, clear as day. He was smiling at the second-floor window, the one that led to Thorne's own bedroom. "Get off my lawn, boy," Thorne shouted, his voice suddenly less steady. "Get back to your quarters, or I'll have you whipped for vagrancy." Samuel did not move. He did not blink. He just held the smile, fixed on the empty room where the colonel slept. Thorne raised the pistol, aiming it into the darkness, but he didn't shoot. There was no law against standing. There was no law against smiling. He would look a fool, shooting a grieving, silent boy on his own property. He lowered the gun, his hand trembling slightly. "Martha, get the dogs." But by the time the overseer arrived with the hounds, Samuel was gone. He had melted back into the pines, leaving nothing but the echo of that terrible, gentle smile. It began to wear on the colonel. Thorne was a man built on a foundation of inherited guilt. His father, the old colonel, had been a man of biblical cruelties, a man who had built the plantation's wealth on casual brutality. Thorne, softer and weaker, ruled by ledgers and economic threats rather too than the lash, but he slept in the house his father built. He knew what had happened in the cellar, in the barns, in the very room he slept in, and now a boy born of that legacy was standing in his yard, smiling at the empty spaces where the memories lived. The superstitions of the county, usually reserved for the black community, began to infect the big house. The servants whispered. They said the boy was touched. They said he was communing with the spirits of those the old colonel had murdered. They said he was smiling because Ilara's ghost was standing right next to Elias Thorne, whispering in his ear. Things started to go missing, small things. A harness buckle, a bag of lye from the smokehouse, a particular knife from the kitchen. Nothing of value, nothing that pointed to theft. Just gone. Then, one night, Thorne was working late in his study, the room where his father had conducted his brutal business. He was jumpy. The harvest was looking thin, the drought was settling in, and the bank in Memphis was sending unpleasant letters. He looked up from his figures and his breath caught. Samuel was standing on the other side of the window. He was not on the porch. He was on the ground, 3 feet below, yet his face was perfectly level with the window as if he were floating. He was smiling, not at Thorne, but at the empty chair beside the desk, the one his father used to sit in. Thorne yelled and stumbled back, knocking over his chair. He grabbed the poker from the fireplace and ran to the window, flinging it open. There was no one there. No footprints in the soft dirt beneath the window. Nothing. Just the suffocating night air and the chirping of crickets. Thorne didn't sleep in his bedroom that night. He locked himself in the study, a pistol on the desk, the whiskey bottle close at hand. He told himself it was the stress, the heat, but he kept looking at the empty chair his father had used, and for the first time in his life he felt he was not alone in the room. The psychological siege had begun. The community, both black and white, watched. The other sharecroppers left small tokens by the Whitlock's door, a piece of dried fruit, a carved piece of wood, not for Samuel, but for the spirits he was clearly entertaining. They saw him as a conduit, a vessel of the land's long memory. Marcus, his father, began to look at his own son with a kind of holy terror. Samuel was no longer his boy. He was something else. He was the reckoning. Thorne's authority, built on the illusion of absolute control, began to crack. A man who cannot control a silent, smiling boy cannot control a harvest. One afternoon, Thorne cornered Samuel by the gin house. He grabbed him by the shirt, his fleshy face purple with rage and a deeper, colder fear. "What do you want?" he hissed, his voice cracking. "Stop it! Whatever you are doing, stop it!" Samuel looked at him. For the first time, his gaze moved from the empty air and settled directly on Thorne's eyes. The smile widened, just slightly. It was bright, beatific, and utterly devoid of mercy. He didn't need to say a word. His smile said it all. "I see you. I see what you are. And I see what is standing right behind you." Thorne shoved him away, stumbling back as if he'd been burned. He fled to the big house, slamming and bolting the door in the middle of the afternoon, screaming for his servants that the boy had put a hex on him. The drought was worsening. The cotton was withering on the stalk, and Elias Thorne, the master of the land, was now a prisoner in his own home, haunted not by a phantom, but by a 17-year-old boy who simply smiled at the empty rooms where the real crimes had been committed. The air grew tighter, waiting for the snap. The drought was not a passive thing. It was an occupation. The sky became a white metallic sheet, reflecting heat until the air itself seemed to shimmer with malice. The ground cracked, the fissures running like jagged scars through the fields. The cotton, which had promised a meager recovery, turned brown and brittle on the stalk. The leaves withered, then dropped, leaving skeletal trees. The well near the sharecropper cabins ran dry, and the creek beds were nothing but dust and smooth, hot stones. The land was dying, and it was taking the ledger book with it. Elias Thorne's world was built on numbers, on the predictable yield of cotton converting to cash, which converted to power. That system was collapsing. The drought was an act of God, yes, but to Thorne, it felt personal. It felt targeted. It felt like a judgment, and he knew exactly who the judge was. His nights were sleepless agonies. He no longer slept in the master bedroom. He rotated through guest rooms, but it didn't help. The smile was everywhere. He saw it in the heat haze rising from the fields. He saw it in the grain of the wood on his desk. He saw it, worst of all, when he looked in the mirror. He had stopped shaving. His hands shook so badly he had cut himself twice, and the sight of his own blood had sent him into a blind panic. He drank constantly, but the whiskey only sharpened the edges of his fear. The servants, who once moved with practiced invisibility, now watched him with wide, knowing eyes. His authority was a ghost. He was the master of a graveyard, haunted by a single living boy. The breaking point came on a Sunday, a day that was supposed to be for God, a day of rest, but the heat offered none. Thorne, haggard and smelling of stale sweat and spirits, had watched from his veranda as the sharecroppers walked the 2 miles to their small wooden church. He watched them return, fanning themselves, their hymns sounding thin and desperate in the dead air. He saw Samuel. The boy was not with the others. He was standing alone by the ruined gin house, the epicenter of the plantation's commerce. He was staring at the scales, the large iron hooks used for weighing the cotton bales, and he was smiling. That was the final violation, smiling at the instruments of the ledger, smiling at the very heart of Thorne's power. Something snapped in the colonel. It was beyond strategy, beyond fear. It was pure, primal rage. This thing had to be confronted. It had to be ended. He didn't bother with his horse. He strode from the veranda, his boots kicking up clouds of fine red dust. He marched across the yard, past the withered crepe myrtles, toward the gin house. The other families, seeing him, froze. This was not a normal visit from the owner. This was a confrontation. They gathered in silent, terrified clusters, too scared to flee, too mesmerized to look away. Thorne stormed up to the boy, his face congested and purple. "You," he breathed, the word a ragged gasp. Samuel Whitlock turned his head slowly. The silence of the gathered crowd was absolute. The only sound was the buzzing of a fly somewhere in the terrible heat. Samuel looked at the colonel, and the smile remained, calm, patient, as if he had been expecting him. "You did this," Thorne whispered, his voice trembling. He pointed a shaking finger first at the dead fields, then at the white-hot sky. "This is your work. You and your devils." Samuel said nothing. He simply held his gaze, his smile unwavering. "Stop it!" Thorne's voice cracked, rising to a shout. "Whatever curse you've put on this land, you take it back. You hear me, boy? Take it back." The crowd flinched. Marcus, Samuel's father, took a half-step forward, his hands clenched, but his wife pulled him back. There was nothing to be done. They were witnessing a battle between two worlds, and they were trapped in the middle. "Speak!" Thorne roared. He grabbed the front of Samuel's thin shirt, bunching the fabric in his fist. He brought his face inches from the boy's. "I am your master. I own this land. I own you. You will answer me." The declaration hung in the air, a grotesque anachronism. I own you. A lie, but a lie that still had the power to kill. And then, the crime. Samuel's expression changed. It was the first time in months. The serene, distant smile faded. He blinked, slowly, as if recognizing someone. His gaze shifted from Thorne's eyes to a point just over the colonel's left shoulder. The smile returned, but it was entirely different. It was not serene. It was not a void. It was a smile of intimate, personal recognition, a smile of welcome. He looked, for all the world, like he was seeing a cherished friend he had not seen in years. A small, almost inaudible gasp escaped the crowd. Thorne felt it. He felt the collective intake of breath. He felt the sudden icy drop in temperature that was only in his own veins. He felt the burning focus of Samuel's gaze on the air behind him. He had to look. He couldn't stop himself. He let go of Samuel's shirt and turned, stumbling, to see what phantom, what devil, what spirit the boy was finally acknowledging. There was nothing. There was only the empty yard, the dead trees, and the shimmering, silent heat. Thorne turned back to Samuel. The boy was still smiling at the space, that awful welcoming smile. "What?" Thorne pleaded. "What do you see?" Samuel's smile widened. He nodded, just once, at the empty air, as if in greeting, and Elias Thorne saw. He did not see with his eyes. He saw with the guilt that had been soaked into his bones since birth. The empty air resolved. It took a shape. It was his father, the old colonel, whip in hand, his eyes cold. It was the woman his father had kept in the cellar, the one whose name no one dared speak. It was the two men hanged from the oak tree that still stood by the main road. It was the children sold south to Louisiana, their faces small and streaked with tears. And then, floating in front of them all, was Ilara, her small hands split and bleeding, a corn-husk doll clutched in her fingers. They were all there, the legion of the unremembered, and they were all looking at him. The dam of his sanity, eroded by weeks of terror, by the drought, by the whiskey, and by the relentless silent pressure of Samuel's smile, shattered into a million pieces. Thorne screamed. It was a high, thin sound, like an animal. He dropped to his knees in the dust, clawing at his own face. "No!" he shrieked, batting at the empty air. "Not me! It wasn't me!" The crowd watched, paralyzed in disbelief. It was him! Thorne pointed a shaking finger at the empty space where he saw his father. "He did it! He used the whip! I only used the ledger! It's just numbers! It's not the same!" He was confessing. To the ghosts, to the sky, to the silent, watching sharecroppers. "I didn't kill her," he sobbed, now looking at the space where he saw Ilara. "It was the fever. The mule was lame. It was business. It wasn't me." He confessed everything. The skimming of the weights at the gin house, the inflated prices at the company store, the night he'd taken the Pickett's daughter, the cruelty for sport, the cruelty for profit. It all came pouring out, a torrent of poison drawn from a septic soul. He was accusing the phantoms, but he was indicting himself. He was screaming the plantation's secret history into the public record of the dead, dry air. His overseer, a white man named Barrows, finally broke from his shock. This was not just a breakdown, it was a detonation of the entire social order. He and two other white tenants ran forward, grabbing the collapsing colonel by the arms. "It's the heat, sir," Barrows yelled too loud. "The sun's got you." "They're here!" Thorne screamed as they dragged him away, his boots carving two deep lines in the dust. He brought them. The boy brought them all. They hauled him back to the big house, a raving, broken shell of a man. The door slammed shut. In the yard, there was a profound, echoing silence, and then a sound, a single, soft sigh. It came from Samuel Whitlock. The smile was gone. His face, for the first time since his sister's death, was empty. The coldness was gone. The clarity was gone. There was nothing left but the face of a 17-year-old boy, exhausted down to his very bones. The reckoning was complete. He looked at his father, his gaze now clear and human. He gave a single, brief nod. Then Samuel Whitlock turned and began to walk. He didn't walk to his cabin. He walked past the gin house, past the dead fields, and onto the main dirt road that led away from the Thorne plantation. He walked with a steady pace, not looking back. No one stopped him. No one called his name. The crowd, black and white, simply parted and watched him go, a vessel whose purpose had been fulfilled. Elias Thorne was sent away 3 days later. A carriage with shaded windows took him to an asylum in Nashville. The official story, printed in the Somerville paper, was a severe nervous collapse brought on by the heat and financial worries. But everyone who was there knew. They knew it was not the sun. It was the smile. The plantation, already bankrupt, was seized by the bank in Memphis. With Thorne declared insane and his confessions poisoning the very soil, no one would buy the land whole. It was broken up, sold in parcels, the legacy of the Thornes erased in a single auction. Samuel Whitlock was never seen in Fayette County again. His name appeared on no census, no work roll. He stepped out of the ledger of history as clean as a ghost. The story, however, remained. It was told in whispers, in the cabins and in the churches. They didn't call it a crime, they called it justice. They spoke of the quiet boy who had been touched, who had seen the spirits his oppressors tried to deny. The horrifying crime of Samuel Whitlock in the end was not that he had done anything at all. It was that he had simply watched and smiled and forced the empty rooms to finally speak.